on your relationship with this land and the joy that it provides you in your day-to-day life. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the Mississippi and members of Lightfoot Confederacy for protecting this land the generations past and to come, so that we need to be God here instead. Now, to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lightfoot is a missionary and citizen of Lake Superior Valley, Michigan, enrolled in the Huron Bay community of Veronica, Michigan. Her personal heritage really strengthens her commitment and understanding of the challenges and aspirations of the Indigenous community. Sheryl is currently at the University of Minnesota Russell Root and Elizabeth Boone Bennett Chair in Foreign State and Affairs. She will have a joint appointment with the American Indian Studies and the College of Applied Arts. Most recently, she served as Canadian Research Chair in Global Indigenous Rights and Politics at the University of British Columbia. Her research focuses on the implementation of Indigenous rights both globally and domestically. Lightfoot is also served as president of the Native American Indigenous Studies Association and is currently serving as the chair and North American member of the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Prior to her academic career, Lightfoot gained valuable experience through 15 years of volunteer and content work with various American Indian tribes and community-based organizations in Minneapolis and the St. Paul area. During this time, she served as chair of the board of the American Indian Policy Center, a prominent research and advocacy group. And we're so lucky to have her with us today, so I would thank you all and helping me welcome Dr. Lightfoot to the stage.
Thank you so much, Tara, for that very warm and generous introduction. And before we begin, I also want to acknowledge the territory that we are meeting on tonight, the Lightfoot Confederacy. I want to say a special thanks to Paul Mackenzie Jones at the University of Westbury for the invitation. I think he sent me the first invitation 2021, 2022, something like that. We were still in the midst of the pandemic and no one was traveling anywhere, so my gratitude for that. So I'm going to be speaking on the topic of enhanced participation for Indigenous peoples in the United Nations system. And I hope you can understand that talking about UN processes and procedure can get a little dry. So I'm going to try to put as much of a human face on this as I possibly can. But there will be moments, bear with me, where it gets a little bit tedious and dry. But what I'm going to show you is a movement, really. Innovation of a people's desire to be heard that necessarily impacts Indigenous rights, statehood, and how we understand human rights. So, in light of the name of the speaker series, Indigenous Radically, tonight I want to share with you this particular case of enhancing Indigenous people's participation and demonstrate how I think something quite ordinary in the UN system, in international space, actually becomes quite radical when Indigenous people are doing it. And it's often said, and I just had a conversation yesterday about this with someone, it's often said that Indigenous peoples are born political because in a state-centric, settler, colonial world, we don't fit easily. And everything we do to be Indigenous in that state-centric space becomes a political act. And whether we're practicing our cultures, speaking our languages, defending our lands, territories, and resources, or in the case that I want to share with you tonight, advocating for our right to participate in conversations about matters that impact us, we are political. And in international space, in the international realm, when we attempt to do the most ordinary of things, we are disruptive. We're disruptive to the state-centric orders and institutions that we face. So by nature, by doing ordinary things, we are radical. Simply because we are Indigenous peoples seeking to practice our inherent human rights. So just a brief outline of where we're going to go. First thing I want to describe is that Indigenous peoples have a very, very long history of making change, or sometimes called subtle revolutions, particularly in international space. Then we'll look particularly at the case of enhanced participation at the United Nations, which is ongoing, and then briefly touch on some implications for that going forward. So firstly, key point, Indigenous peoples make change. Lots of change in international space, and they have a very long history of doing it. Indigenous peoples who've approached the UN for years, and some of them now approaching 4, even 5 decades, have been there to challenge the institutions that have excluded them and have done violence to them through those exclusions. And that includes institutions like Western law and legal frameworks, states and their institutions, and equally alongside non-Western regimes. And there's not much difference in Indigenous eyes between Western regimes and non-Western regimes. So as some of my earlier research and publications have documented, Indigenous peoples have been subtly creating change at the United Nations for decades, and particularly so in the area of human rights. Now why? Western human rights are not and have never been all that helpful to Indigenous peoples on their face. And Indigenous peoples have needed to battle the human rights institutions every bit as much as Western and even non-Western state structures. Western human rights institutions have never had much to offer, again, on their face, Indigenous peoples in the way of hope, because part of the battle has actually been against the hegemony and superiority, both real and presumed, of Western thought and Western institutions. And we have never much seen the Western human rights institution as being inclusive of Indigenous peoples' needs. So when Indigenous peoples enter those spaces, they are necessarily navigating for change that not only includes them, but also necessarily in the process rewrites and shifts those global spaces. But here's the catch. Indigenous peoples are utilizing those institutions with all of their problematic liberal foundations and origins in order to remake and reshape those institutions so that there's better accommodation for Indigenous people. So please take a quick look at this photograph from 1977. And I promise you, we did have color photos in 1977, but the black and white ones preserve much better the archives. So the black and white ones are the best. So this is the very first delegation of Indigenous peoples that entered the United Nations in Geneva back in the summer of 1977. Now we're approaching 50 years of time. And we're going to come back to this photograph in a few minutes. But this photo, I think, has become, in the Indigenous rights movement on the global level, iconic, as it represents the very beginning, the first steps of Indigenous peoples working in the United Nations to create change at the United Nations, simply by asserting their right to be present and to be included in discussions and to be heard. So in the years since 1977, Indigenous peoples have forged change at the UN in a wide variety of ways. And in each and every case, very ordinary behavior in the international system becomes radical simply because we are Indigenous and, again, don't fit easily or comfortably into the international system. So first of all, there's been quite a dramatic push for inclusion in multiple spaces, in multiple venues, and in multiple modalities. Secondly, and this is a key point to carry forward into our further discussion, the ability to define oneself and represent oneself as a means of self-determining. And then thirdly, reshaping essentially all the institutions that Indigenous people encounter in order to better meet their needs, their principles, their values. And this is a firm push for self-determination. So if we take all three of these key points, we can see some specific examples that will illustrate all three in action. First and foremost, and I love this photograph because it's a juxtaposition of one of the first community-based meetings of international Indigenous people that eventually led to the passage of the UN Declaration on the Right in September 2007. A lot of the same people were in both, so that's, to me, a wonderful thing. So first and foremost was the achievement of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007. The culmination of 30 years of intensive work by Indigenous advocates. And this is a standard-setting document. It's a global consensus document, which recognizes that Indigenous peoples, like all other peoples in the world, have the right of self-determination. It's a fundamental right, and it's the right from which all other human rights flow. And this document says Indigenous peoples are actually equal to all other peoples, but slightly different at the same time. Now, what it required to get there? Significant changes to UN rules. Now, what I brought to you, this photo, is a picture of an Aboriginal man who was about to play the didgeridoo in the General Assembly. What rule does this challenge? Well, the UN actually prohibits all spiritual expressions, prayers, and spiritual ceremonies in its hallways. It is a secular organization by the Charter and by all standing rules. However, since Indigenous peoples came there in 1977, they insisted, absolutely insisted, and they had to fight for this, that they intended to open and close each and every one of their meetings with a prayer or a spiritual expression. It took years to do this because the UN protested very much. And there was even a walkout by one of the chairs at one point. But the Indigenous peoples present just went ahead and did it, and eventually the UN came to accept it. So to this day, every meeting of the UN opens and closes with a spiritual expression of some kind, or a prayer. And that's on a rotating basis. So different Indigenous peoples from different regions will take the floor for different meetings. And this is now something that the UN has, even if they don't embrace it and love it, they've come to accept it as a part of Indigenous work. Secondly, major changes in procedures, or how the UN works. So under UN rules, in every body, states have the right to speak first, they have the right to reply to a statement, and NGOs and academics and others come at the very bottom of the speaking list. In Indigenous spaces and Indigenous institutions, they have changed entirely procedures of work. So the UN mechanisms, which I'm about to show you in a second, all have Indigenous-specific methods of work. Not all states love this because they like their ability to interrupt the conversation, to defend themselves. They don't have that right in Indigenous spaces. Indigenous people have the right to speak first and are prioritized. And again, that was something that was fought for, and no other body in the UN has been able to push through this kind of procedural change. Now, just a couple places that this has happened because Indigenous people have pushed for their own institutions and their own mechanisms within the UN, again, making change. The Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is based out of UN headquarters in New York. It's part of the Economic and Social Council. They meet once a year for 2 weeks in the spring. The meeting begins this year, April 15th, and it gathers together Indigenous people from all over the world who come together to speak about a particular theme or a topic for the 2 weeks. That began in 2001. Much younger than that, but this is the body that I currently serve on, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This one was set up in 2007 in Geneva, so it's part of the human rights system in Geneva. And the mandate of this body is to interpret and to clarify the principles and the articles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples for member states, for civil society, and even for Indigenous peoples. And so we do our work in a number of ways. We also have changed all of the methods of work and procedures to accommodate Indigenous peoples' values and priorities. And then this is also an incredible shift that Indigenous peoples advocated for. Now, if we think about the socio-economic standing of Indigenous peoples around the world, what do we know? Whether it's Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, Kenya, Malaysia, Indonesia, what we know is Indigenous people are the most marginalized, the highest levels of poverty, living often in remote areas. So how are they supposed to get to New York and Geneva? Well, Indigenous thought leaders back in the 1970s devised a system. They set up the voluntary fund. So they go to states every year and ask for pledges for the voluntary fund and create this pool of money that can then be distributed to Indigenous peoples in order to travel to New York and to Geneva. And so this has been a way to equalize and to make the institutions of the UN open to anyone. And so now you have people who live in major urban centers showing up in Geneva and New York. You also have people who come out of the Amazon who had to take a canoe to get to a bush plane, to get to a smaller plane, to get to the international flight to show up in Geneva. Why? Because people did innovative steps and created a funding pool to make this happen. So in light of this history, these rule changes, procedural changes, institutional changes, and funding changes are all extremely important and have each enhanced Indigenous peoples' participation in the international system. However, in the 5 decades that Indigenous people have been appearing at the United Nations, only 2 paths of credentialing and participation are open to them. First, if you want to go to the UN, you can sign up to be part of the delegation of the UN member state. Problem for Indigenous people, they're often in conflict with the member state. And if you sign up to be part of the member state's delegation, you can't take the floor and speak against the member state. So that doesn't work. The other possibility, there are only 2, is to sign up to be self-representing, but as a non-governmental organization. That's for everyone. So whether you're from an actual NGO or whether you're from the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Navajo Nation, your only option is to sign up as a non-governmental organization. So Indigenous governments, Indigenous nations, Indigenous representative institutions to date have never been allowed to represent themselves at the United Nations. And existing methods for their participation are completely inadequate because they are by definition not non-governmental institutions, they're governments. So in practice, this has meant that there are many conversations going on in UN spaces, and Indigenous governments are not there. They cannot speak. They cannot participate. They're not in the room. And yet the conversations and decisions that are being made there, and it's becoming extremely prominent now in the climate change conversations, there are decisions being made there that directly impact them. And that is actually a direct violation of all the principles of self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent on which the UN Declaration itself is based. So the effort here that I want to talk about is a way to make participation in the UN both more meaningful and in keeping with the spirit of the UN Declaration. And the genuine hope that's been expressed by so many Indigenous people over the years is that both the UN General Assembly in New York and the Human Rights Council in Geneva could and should provide Indigenous nations, representative institutions, with a form of status and representation. So in practice, this would mean that Indigenous groups who organize and advocate for themselves internationally without representing or being represented by states would be engaged in a form of global political self-determination that's quite separate from and pushes the boundaries of how we currently think about statehood and sovereignty. So, in my time with you this evening, I want to share with you the ongoing efforts and the current state of play in the movement to advance Indigenous peoples' participation in both the General Assembly in New York and the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Now, all of this work originally started as what I call accidental field work. So I was attending an entirely different UN meeting, and someone, as that meeting was finished, kind of nudged me and said, "Oh, are you going to the other meeting tomorrow?" "What meeting?" "Oh, you should stay. You should come to this other meeting." And that's how I got into this process. And for the first number of years, and that was 2016. So for the first number of years, I was attending and participating in these different discussions and consultations and drafting meetings as an academic observer. And so I followed the process since 2016 with quite a bit of enthusiasm. However, since 2021, I've had an official role on the UN expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. So I moved from observer to participant very quickly and immediately, because the expert mechanism is a strong supporter and advocate and actually actor in this story. So in order to understand the story and to be able to understand where we are now, we have to go back to the beginning of the story, which in this case is now 101 years ago, 1923. I've heard of long movements, but 101 years is that kind of stretching some limits. So in 1923, so this is just a few years after the end of World War I, prior to the Great Depression and World War II, Haudenosaunee chief Dispersed was sent by his people, by his council, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, to, at that point, what was the brand new League of Nations. So this is long before the UN gets set up. This is the League of Nations experiment between the two world wars. And because the Haudenosaunee Confederacy had signed treaties with the Dutch and others long before the British and the French arrived, they had never ceded their lands to Britain, later Canada, never signed any treaty to join Canada, never sold or ceded their sovereignty, and so the Confederacy still views itself as a sovereign people, as its own Indigenous government. And they do not seek representations through Canada or the United States, and in many cases resisted. So Chief Dispersed, in 1923, was sent by actually the clan mothers and the council to Geneva, to the League of Nations, to protest the actions of Canada, which at the time was committing huge treaty violations against the Haudenosaunee. And Dispersed marching orders were to highlight those treaty violations and bring them to the League and have their treaties recognized as international treaties by other countries. Now, since he was going to protest Canada, and he didn't consider himself Canadian or American, they sit right on what is now a border. He, at that time, this is before passports were official, he traveled on his own travel papers issued by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and went to Switzerland and went to Geneva. Now, he traveled to Geneva, of course, at that time it was by ship, so it took several weeks. He stayed in Geneva for a year, asking the League of Nations for speaking time. Every day he showed up at the door of the League of Nations and asked to be admitted and asked to speak. And every day for a year, he was firmly denied. And after a year of trying, he returned to North America. But in the time that he was away, Canada militarily occupied Haudenosaunee lands and forcibly installed an Indian Acts-and Council, attempting to disband the traditional governance system of the Confederacy. Now, they did install an Indian Acts-and Council, which still exists, but they did not succeed in destroying the traditional system of government, which remains very much still in place, working kind of uncomfortably parallel with the band council system. Now, one sad end to this first story is that Dispahe was never able to return to his home because he didn't feel safe with the military operation going on by the Canadian state. And so he went instead into exile in the northern part of New York State, and he died there within a year. But now we'll return to the photographs that I promised from 1977 that I promised would reappear. And this photo, of course, of Indigenous peoples entering the UN grounds in Geneva for the very first time represents, in many ways, a victory over Dispahe's plight, because the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is present in this picture, and they are getting that entrance and that speaking time that was denied Dispahe so many years earlier. And they participated in the first of what would become many, many meetings at the UN to follow. Further, and most interesting, I think, like Dispahe years before them, the delegation from Haudenosaunee did not travel on Canadian or United States passports, but rather they traveled to Geneva on their own Haudenosaunee passports. They came to the United Nations in Geneva as themselves, representing themselves as an Indigenous government, and they did so in the most ordinary ways. They traveled and arrived on their own nation's passport and asked in the UN for speaking rights as a nation. But again, the problem is, under UN rules and credentials and registration, that if Indigenous people want to speak at the UN, they must register either as part of a state delegation, in which case they don't exactly get to speak unless the state gives a permission, or an NGO. Now, for some individual Haudenosaunee and for many Indigenous peoples, organizing as an NGO does not present any particular difficulties. And in this photo on the right-hand side, we see Haudenosaunee, two Haudenosaunee people, Kenneth Deere and Tommy Deere, yes, they're related, and they are both participating and speaking at the UN in an NGO capacity. However, if their colleagues wish to show up as an Indigenous government or representative institution, they're denied speaking rights, because there's no way for them to get credentials under that particular category. So again, they must either join the settler colonial government or register as a non-governmental organization. Case in point, both in 2019 and then again in 2023, just last summer, the present carrier of the name Dispahe, so Dispahe are traditional chiefly names that exist and they get passed down to different individuals. So the current carrier of that name, Dispahe, who is in the feathered hat, he went to Geneva both in 2019 and 2023 and was also denied credentials and speaking rights as a leader of his people. So here's the problem that the first Dispahe had, still 100 years old. And then here, a couple of the other photos from last summer, 2023. It's a very important commemorative events for the 100th anniversary of the first Dispahe's time in Geneva, who was also seeking to represent his people. So there was a march, there was a meeting at the Geneva Town Hall where the mayor of Geneva presented a plaque to the current Dispahe and the delegation. Now, if we look to the UN Declaration itself, what does it say about this particular issue? There are two very important articles that address this problem. So Article 18 says very clearly that Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights, through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own Indigenous decision-making institutions. So Article 18 basically says that the countries of the world, all the UN member states, agreed that Indigenous peoples have the right to their own governments, elected or appointed or selected in their own ways, according to their own laws, rules, regulations. And the very next article, Article 19, says States shall, and I love it when the Declaration says states shall, because it's the strongest possible language that one can use in the human rights system. Not may, not consider, not take into account. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. So clearly this means in the domestic context, here, it's back. Okay. Don't touch it. Okay, so clearly in the domestic context, this is pretty obvious. States need to consult and seek to obtain Indigenous people's consent before they do any legislative or administrative things. But that also means international space. So when we talk about the climate change conversations and other conservation or protected areas conversations that are happening on a global level, states have an obligation to meet with Indigenous peoples' representative institutions and have them participate in those conversations because those conversations and decisions can affect their rights and do affect their rights. So the Declaration is actually extremely clear on this point, that there needs to be a pathway, there needs to be a way for Indigenous representative institutions, governments, nations, however people organize themselves. We have a huge world, so there's an incredible diversity of ways that Indigenous peoples organize themselves in terms of governance, that the states and the UN have an obligation to work with them. So what's the next step in the story? Well, just a few years after the UN Declaration passed through the General Assembly, which was 2007, so 2013, only 6 years later, Indigenous peoples began quite a deliberate campaign to address this systematic exclusion in the United Nations of their governments. So in the summer of 2013, a very large Indigenous peoples gathering was held in the very northern Arctic city of Alta, Norway, and it was hosted by the Sami Parliament of Norway. And the aim of this gathering, this meeting, was to set a concrete global agenda, a unified agenda amongst Indigenous peoples of all the 7 regions for action on implementing the UN Declaration. And specifically, in that vein, it was a preparatory meeting because they were aiming to get themselves organized and unified before the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples was going to be held in New York in 2014. So the outcome document of the Alta Conference is definitely worth a read. It's only a couple pages long, but it sets out what at that point was Indigenous peoples' statements of solidarity and direction for action. And it addressed the problem of Indigenous nation representation at the UN directly. So paragraph 10 in the Alta document reads, in very UN terminology, pursuant to the universal application of the right of self-determination for all peoples, recommends that the UN recognize Indigenous peoples and nations based on our original free existence, inherent sovereignty, and the right of self-determination in international law. Now I bolded this, it's hard to see, but we call for, at minimum, permanent observer status within the United Nations system, enabling our direct participation through our own governments and parliaments. And then it goes on, our own governments include, and then I've left off some stuff because it goes through an articulation of what that means. So a year later, at the World Conference, at the General Assembly in New York, 2014, here's where a radical shift occurred. It was no longer just Indigenous peoples demanding equal rights of self-determination in UN participation, but at the World Conference in 2014, the UN member states also committed in their outcome document to making this reality. Massive shift. So the 2014 World Conference set in formal motion a process that contained provisions that committed them to consider ways to do broad consultations and to set a path to enable the participation of Indigenous representative institutions of UN bodies on issues that impact them. Now, following up on that UN member state commitment, the General Assembly in 2015 passed this resolution that required the President of the General Assembly to conduct formal consultations with Indigenous peoples, member states, and UN mechanisms and international institutions on the question of Indigenous peoples' participation, and to present the compilation of his views in 2017. So the President of the General Assembly appointed 4 expert advisors, both permanent representatives of the nations of Finland and Ghana, along with 2 very well-known Indigenous legal experts. So former UN Special Rapporteur, Professor James Anaya, who's currently at University of Colorado Law from North America, and Dr. Claire Charters, who's Maori legal scholar and legal expert, currently with the University of Auckland and the New Zealand Human Rights Commission from Aotearoa, New Zealand. So they started holding consultations in late 2016 and the early part of 2017, and they found a broad consensus that Indigenous peoples have the full right to participate in discussions and decisions on all matters that might affect them and their rights. And by April 2017, things were rolling along quite well at this point. The 4 advisors together had drafted a resolution, which was called, as many are, on their first draft, the Zero Draft. And it was presented in another round of consultations that spring at the Permanent Forum. And the draft text that they wrote created a brand new and distinct status for Indigenous representative institutions at the United Nations General Assembly, an entirely new category of UN participation. Now, coming out of those consultations, there were still some sticky points that needed further discussion. These are not small sticking points. Venue. Where would Indigenous peoples be able to participate with this new status? In the General Assembly, in other committees, inside events, where? So there was not a full decision on this question. And then next was modalities and attributes. Now this is UN speak for what rights do they have? Do they have the right of reply like a state does? Do they have the right to vote on a resolution? Can they submit resolutions? Table them for discussion? Can they submit written statements? So this was all left up for discussion. And then finally, and probably most contested, selection mechanism. What sort of procedure should be in place to secure Indigenous people's right to participate, and who decides and how? And all 3 of these areas, as you can imagine, invited quite vigorous discussion. And it was at this point that the problems and the gaps became quite clear. So the few states that were speaking and commenting at that point, like China, felt very strongly that any selection mechanism that would be put in place must be controlled by the UN member states. And Indigenous peoples, of course, held the entirely opposite view, that Indigenous peoples organizations would not subject themselves to a state-driven process to decide who they are, that it must be only Indigenous people deciding who Indigenous people are, and that the states would necessarily discriminate. Now, a joint statement by Canada, Australia, and New Zealand expressed full satisfaction with the Zero Draft and wanted to move it forward, as it would establish a distinct status, and Norway also expressed quite strong support at that point. But with China and Indonesia and Russia and others having their views, a strong growing concern emerged amongst the Indigenous advocates that whatever was developing could potentially weaken and undermine the very strong set of rights that they had fought so hard for in the UN Declaration. So in May of 2017, a new set of negotiations began amongst the member states, and only the member states. So at this point, Indigenous peoples and the formal advisors were no longer in the room. And this is when things blew apart. So no consensus. Most of the states present, except for Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Norway, Finland, required that state recognition of Indigenous peoples was an absolute requirement. And they wanted also a state objection procedure, a veto procedure, to exclude Indigenous peoples if they wished. And of course, those who were supporting the zero draft did not accept state recognition as a mandatory criteria and could not accept state objection or veto. And again, the overwhelming concern became clear through intelligence pipelines. So Indigenous people got word from a few friendly member states that were in the room about what was actually happening in there. And there was serious alarm. And the overwhelming concern again was that any requirements being discussed actively by the states at that juncture would undermine existing standards. So at the end of this, Indigenous peoples decided that at this juncture they would put a pause on the process. They would create a draft resolution to take no decision at this point, do a pullback, a regrouping. And while this was quite a disappointing result at the time, it did have the benefit of keeping the issue on the table in some respect, keep it alive, and it also prevented the states from diminishing Indigenous peoples' rights at that juncture. So, what was clear after that 2017 experiment and the non-resolution, as it's come to be called, Indigenous peoples needed to regroup, reorganize, and they did so in the couple of years going forward. So, at the same time, they also decided to turn some attention to Geneva and to the Human Rights Council. And some were saying, well, New York is where all of the heavy politics are, let's try Geneva for a while. So they began to work with states in Geneva. And part of the regrouping and the re-strategizing for Indigenous peoples involved quite a large gathering in Quito, Ecuador. And I have to point out the date here, late January 2020. So this was kind of a global Indigenous summit of sorts on the issue. And it devised a new strategy, and they decided to target the Human Rights Council in Geneva first and leave New York alone for the moment. They also put together a coordinating body, Indigenous coordinating body. So it had 2 representatives from each of the 7 regions, plus a chair and a co-chair. And so there was now a structure in place for Indigenous peoples to talk to one another, strategize, and so on. Then came the pandemic. No meetings were possible in person. The global summit was the last time people got together. So in the pandemic years, 2020, 2021, even a little bit into 2022, there was no progress, but there was also no retrenchment. So they considered this a success. It's just a giant pause. And it was decided that a pause was preferable because trying to negotiate with states and with institutions in an online environment just wasn't going to be feasible. It really needed face-to-face conversations, tough negotiations. So coming out of the pandemic, by 2022, of course, gatherings became possible again. UN work returned to in-person. So in the summer of 22, I actually got to go to Geneva in person to participate in the expert mechanism versus the online period in 2021. And in-person work returned gradually, both in New York and Geneva. And the enhanced participation file was sitting there in Geneva waiting to be picked up. Largely due to the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous people, which of course is based there. So the expert mechanism, and I'm very proud of this, hosted in November of 22 in Geneva a 4-day expert workshop where some of those outstanding details, venue, modalities, selection, criteria selection mechanism were discussed, 1 day each. And I would say some key points began to be banged out by Indigenous people, with some states in the room, with other NGOs and international participants. And what was identified in that meeting was what's now been called kind of consensus landing zones. And some key points, the list is long, but just some key points, what was decided. So in venue, the where, it was decided that Indigenous peoples' representative institutions or governments should be able to participate in all works of the Human Rights Council, based on the principles of the UN Declaration. In terms of modalities, what can they do? The decision was that this new status for Indigenous peoples should be rights-based, and it should be as similar as possible to the observer status in the Human Rights Council, which is everything except the right to vote. Only states hold the right to vote. So Indigenous peoples would be able to participate by co-sponsoring resolutions, presenting resolutions, participating in informal negotiations on resolutions, being able to speak in general debates in the council, interactive dialogues, panel discussions, and just like the institutions that had been created in 2001 and 2007, they would invert the rules. So Indigenous speakers would have priority at the Human Rights Council when they're there. They would be allowed to speak for at least 3 minutes and submit written statements to the Human Rights Council. In terms of selection criteria, it was decided, again, that this should be rights-based, and especially on the rights to self-identification, self-determination, and self-government. Recognizing the need at the same time for some kind of objective criteria for who should be there and who should not be, without actually creating a definition of Indigenous peoples. So it was decided that any sort of Indigenous peoples representative institution that would be allowed to participate must have a mandate by its own people to be sending someone. And this has to be able to be measured and seen by the selection body. It was decided that state recognition could be a factor, but not the factor in deciding Indigenous peoples' requirements. And that whatever criteria are developed should be determined in a way that cannot be misused by other entities in order to undermine Indigenous peoples' rights. And finally, in terms of the selection mechanism, or who decides, this should be a newly created and independent body that would serve as a selection mechanism. And the decision-making of that body would be final, not subject to member state veto, and it would also include an accessible and timely appeal mechanism. So if there's a negative decision, that someone has a right to appeal. Very excitingly, and I got to be personally involved in the negotiation of this resolution. So every year the Human Rights Council does an Indigenous Peoples Resolution in the fall. And so negotiations for that begin in Geneva in mid to late September, and proceed through the first part of October. So since I was chair of the expert mechanism, I was the one at those negotiations in September, October. And so in October 23, the Human Rights Council's annual Indigenous Peoples Resolution included a few more steps. And this was at the recommendation of the NREC, the expert mechanism. The Human Rights Council decides to continue to discuss and develop steps and measures to enable the full participation of Indigenous peoples, representatives, and institutions. It has decided to hold, I didn't touch it. Sure. It has decided to hold two-day meetings, but one in 2024 before the next round of the Human Rights Council in the fall, and then another one in early 2025. In order to further develop those 4 points, venue, modality, selection mechanism, selection criteria, into very concrete actions and ways to move forward to a status. Very excitedly, in the Human Rights Council session coming up this year, October and September 2024, the Council has plans for a pilot. They have said that this year They will credential a handful of Indigenous peoples' governments, representative institutions, to participate and to speak on the floor. And the intent is it will be one rep from each of the 7 sociocultural regions as defined by Indigenous peoples. What those are: North America, Latin America and the Caribbean, the Pacific, huge area, but dominated by Australia and New Zealand, but also includes all of the islands, Asia, Africa, a huge area that's Russia, Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, massive territory, the Arctic, and so the idea is that there'll be one representative from each of those that will be credentialed in this pilot by the Human Rights Council. Further, in Geneva, there'll be new credentials issued. So this is a photo just of a selection of UN badges from Geneva. And you can see there's a big letter on all of them, and they each mean something different. So the D means a state delegate, so ambassador or a diplomat. P is for press. T is what Indigenous peoples have a lot of times when they're just participating in a conference, so T means temporary pass. And then the big N that is the problem is NGO. So this is what currently exists in part, and this is how Indigenous peoples have been required to register. But in September 24 this year, Geneva at the Human Rights Council is going to issue a new badge, the IP, for Indigenous peoples representative institutions as part of the pilot. And then, not to leave out New York, some late breaking news from New York, from the General Assembly, where the process again has been stalled since 2017. So what is that, 7 years now? Just in the past month, the President of the General Assembly has appointed a new set of co-facilitators to restart that consultation process that has been stalled since 2017. So who do we have? We have 2 state representatives, 2 state ambassadors. So we have Ambassador Bob Ray from Canada, who's currently the Canadian permanent representative, the ambassador to the UN. And then from Peru, we have Ambassador Victor Garcia Toma. And then from Indigenous peoples, we have, again, Dr. Claire Charters from New Zealand, who was one of the advisors the first time around. And she is joined by one of my predecessors on the expert mechanism, Lunas, and they use the first name last in their culture. So Lunas Belkacem, who's Amazigh from Morocco. And so this is the new team now in New York. And the Indigenous members were announced literally like last week. So they are just getting the work reorganized in New York. So let's step back from the story and take a look at, again, thinking radically and the ordinary becoming radical. So on the one hand, a non-state actor and a non-NGO status at the United Nations is actually quite a normal and ordinary reality. There are a number of groups and entities that have participated for years at the United Nations that are not member states and are not NGOs. There is a category already for non-member states to participate. The biggest examples here, the most prominent, are the Holy See, or the Vatican, and the Palestinian Authority, who's been there now as a non-member observer for quite a number of years. Taiwan also falls into this category at present. There's also a wide array of intergovernmental institutions. So examples here are the European Union, or the League of Arab States, or the Organization of American States, the African Union. They can be credentialed and participate in the United Nations. And then there's another huge group of specialized agencies. So this includes like the World Bank, the IMF, the WHO, the International Labour Organization, could go on and on. There are hundreds of them. And so on the one hand, creating this fourth category, or this new category, specifically for Indigenous peoples' governments or representative institutions, is normal. It's setting out a category for participation where there has been an exclusion or an oversight, if you're being kind. But of course, whenever Indigenous peoples set out to make change at the UN, it's also radical, because these critical changes require system changes, and rule changes, and procedural changes, and functions. So if we look to the past and take some key lessons from all of those ways in the past that Indigenous peoples have made change, and forged change, and created institutional change at the UN, how is this most likely to happen? First of all, Indigenous peoples cannot do this alone. They need to find key global allies. They can find these among usually a small set of member states and big NGOs, international organizations and non-governmental institutions, particularly the Geneva-based ones, the human rights ones. Now, they have a few friendly states in their pocket. Canada is very strong, Norway is strong, New Zealand has been strong, now with the new government, we're not sure. Australia is very strong, Finland. There are also key allies in Mexico and Guatemala, sometimes Peru. We have the ambassador, so we hope that's an ally. There are this handful of what's called friendly states in this process. And that is a much smaller group than the so-called group of friends, which is not so friendly to this cause. That includes China, Russia, Indonesia, India, and a whole bunch of other quite big and powerful countries. But Indigenous peoples need those allies and in those spaces. And so while there's a small group, that group needs to expand, and more allies need to be found. Secondly, as always, Indigenous peoples need to, on the one hand, play by the rules, but also push to rewrite the rules, all at the same time. And that's why I talk about being radical in the ordinary. Because the rules as they stand will not work. Rules need to be changed. But in order to do that, they need to work through the rules in the system and have those conversations. So it creates this kind of oxymoron in a psychological way. But it's one that Indigenous peoples are quite familiar with if we look back. And then thirdly, and this is important, patience, tenacity, it's a long game. Nothing at the UN, nothing in international politics happens quickly. And generally, Indigenous people succeed by being assertive and tenacious. Diplomatic, assertive, and tenacious. And sometimes, very often, the changes that they're able to forge in this space are kind of not showing up in the newspaper, they're not big media stories. I'll bet most of you never heard this story before tonight. They happen under the radar, but they are cracks. You know when ice gets into a rock and then it is able to expand and crack the rock? That's how Indigenous peoples operate in international space. So with that, I'm going to say Chicken-Butch. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you for listening to my story. And I hope that now that you have the awareness, you'll be watching carefully for these changes, these radical, ordinary changes. Thank you very much.
You don't get to run away just yet. So you can't hear me. This is for you on behalf of the Indigenous Rights team. We'd like to thank you so much for coming tonight, sharing your knowledge with us. And on behalf of all of you here, we hope you have a great yesterday night. And we thank you so much for coming and listening. And we hope to see you at our next event soon. And one more really, really big round of applause, and thank you so much to us.
Originally as an NGO, they got credentialed as as an NGO, and they came and began to participate as an NGO. And then there was a movement for them to get observer status in the United Nations. And I don't know who started it, if it was Yasser Arafat or some member state suggested it, but they began, there was a speech in the General Assembly, and Yasser Arafat gave a speech in the General Assembly, and they actually got their status within like 14 days. The General Assembly granted them observer status as the PLO, and they've had it ever since. So then when the PLO became the Palestinian Authority, which is the government of the West Bank, or parts of it, so that's the piece that has observer status, because they're the child of the PLO. So it's not Palestine, per se, and if you want the history of the British Mandate and the Balfour Declaration and the partition by the UN, that's a long history, and I'm going to refer you to books. Not TikTok, books. You'll get better information from books. It's a very long and complicated and nuanced and complex and really quite sad story.
Do you have any other questions at all?
And if I could just add to that, it's not lost on Indigenous peoples that the PLO got their status in weeks, and this has taken years, like 101 years. So yeah, that's a rub.
Thank you for your presentation. It's good to see that Canada is a strong supporter of this, and hopefully that continues. And you mentioned quite a few countries during your presentation, but I don't clearly mention anything about the United States. Where is the United States in all this?
That is a really good question. I think a lot of it depends on who's in the White House. So the years that this process was active in the General Assembly, 2016, 2017, you know who was in the White House. And the United States was not at all interested in the United Nations. They stopped paying their dues. They're currently still behind on their dues, which was creating a huge financial crisis in the United Nations, which I'm feeling quite a big pinch because it's affecting our mandated activities for the coming years. So 2016, 17, Donald Trump was in the White House. There was no interest in UN processes whatsoever, and no interest in Indigenous peoples. So they were absent. They pulled out of the Human Rights Council. They were a non-player completely. That changed a bit with President Biden. There was some return to engagement in the international system, but in terms of this process, they've been really slow to come back around, and that's been a disappointment. Now, what I have personally observed in Geneva is that the diplomats at the permanent mission for the United States in Geneva are kind of floundering because they want to be involved, but they're trying to recover from the Trump years. And this is kind of funny, but she follows around the Australian diplomat to see what he says and what he does, because apparently that's their model. Not a bad thing. But they're not following Canada and they're not following New Zealand. They're following the Australians. At the moment, the Australians are quite strongly supportive, although they're quibbling on a bit of the language. And I don't fully understand what their issue is, but they are insisting that the language be Indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions. And the Indigenous coordinating body, the Indigenous peoples body, takes objection to that. They want the language to be Indigenous peoples' representative institutions, because they're not sure representatives could be anything. And Australia's really stuck on that, and the Indigenous coordinating body is firm on their language. So there's a little bit of a gap. But if that language piece can be worked out, Australia's on board. But the United States, I mean, come November, who knows again? Plus, they haven't paid their dues. And at the moment, the rest of 2024, we have no money to do any mandated activities. So it has a huge impact on the Indigenous mechanisms out of Geneva. So they need to pay their dues. But I hear they passed a budget a few days ago, so maybe things will look a little better. But when they don't pay their dues, then others follow and don't pay their dues. Excellent question. I wish I had a good answer.
My question is a follow-up on the previous question regarding the state of Palestine. You mentioned that it was passed in 48 days. Don't you think that that might be like a maneuver to bring the Palestinians out of military and violent resistance against the occupation of Israel to Palestine and bring them to sit on the table as an entity, like a government entity that they can talk to versus the Indigenous not being passed as an observer status, giving them permanence into like a government body of some sorts?
You know, I hesitate to speculate what was in all the member states' minds when they passed that resolution for the PLO's observer status. It was like in the 1980s, so 40 years ago. I've looked at the documents, but it isn't clear what the motivations were. It was just very fast. Yasser Arafat made a speech and said the PLO needed to be an observer. About 14 days later, there was a vote, and it happened. And there wasn't much conversation about it. What I can say is that in all the years since 1948, the UN in general has been supportive of Palestinian self-determination and moving forward on that. So I think if you're going to put it up to a vote in the United Nations General Assembly, you're going to get wide support. I haven't seen that ever go any other way.
Do you have any other closing questions at all?
You have a question?
Oh, gosh. Okay. There we go. Good luck, everybody.
Thank you. I'm just curious, you mentioned the US is following Australia around.
My personal observation.
And yet, so I'm curious how much did you see as an observer at the UN, the international position on Indigenous peoples? Does it directly reflect their domestic position on Indigenous peoples? Because I know that the Biden administration just touted how much funding they're giving to Indigenous peoples, how much more investment they're doing, 2 weeks ago after the White House summit. And yet here internationally, they're sort of, as you say, floundering and following Australia. And Australia domestically has a much more ambivalent relationship domestically. So it seems counterintuitive to me. So I'm wondering what you see in the middle of it all.
That's a good observation, Paul. I think, especially in recent years, the well-funded Indigenous groups by states that show up at the UN are from Canada, New Zealand, and the Nordics. They have the best funding flows from the state government to their organizations, and quite a bit of autonomy. So even though those countries flow funds into Indigenous organizations, they don't then expect to fully control those organizations. They do provide them, if not full autonomy, pretty good autonomy. Canada and Australia, it varies a lot. The United States and Australia, it varies a lot. So there are good funding cycles and bad funding cycles. And so Indigenous organizations are constantly whiplashed between whether they have money or not have money. And strangely enough, the dichotomy is that Canada and New Zealand, especially in the Nordics, and I think the factor personally is that for all of those countries, they're not the big powers in the region. They're kind of the younger sibling next to big powers. So for Canada, we're right next to this big superpower. We kind of pale by comparison in terms of population, GDP, and so on. New Zealand's the little sibling next to big Australia, which if you look on the map doesn't look that different, but in terms of population, GDP, it really is that different, and they're dominated. And then there's the little Nordics, 5 million people in Norway,
7 million in Sweden, 5 million in Finland, not big countries, not huge global powers. For them, the international space becomes very important, both for Indigenous people and for the governments. And so I think that's actually the factor that brings people forward. It's their position in terms of geopolitics, global politics, regional geopolitics. Again, my observation, but that's my suspicion.
Yeah, thank you so much. Do we have any other questions? Going once, going twice.
But we have time for coffee and cookies.
Yes. Well, if you have no other questions, then I will let you go again for one last time to thank Dr. Lightfoot for coming.